Welcome to Fort Bend County Library's Texas Talks on the history of the Comanche Indians in Texas. This is Nicholas Cox, Professor of U.S. and Texas History at Houston Community College in Stafford. I'd like to thank Donna Dare and the library staff for bringing this talk to you, and I look forward to seeing everyone in person once again, when safe. The cultural origins of the Comanche people begin before European exploration of the North American Great Plains. As an offshoot of the Great Basin Shoshone peoples, the Comanches migrated along the eastern edge of the Great Basin and down the Rocky Mountains into the central plains of modern Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas in the late 1600s and early 1700s. Before Spanish and later European explorers arrived in Texas, a number of indigenous cultures resided on the Gulf Coast, the upper Sabine River Valley, and along the Rio Grande from the coast into the interior of modern New Mexico. Early indigenous peoples, often named by archaeologists the Proto-Indians, established the cultural foundations of the Caranqua, Caddo, Jumano, and other native people that the Spanish would encounter in the 1500s. Upon the first entrance of the Spanish into Texas, the native peoples did not yet include the Comanche, however, who arrived later and are first noted by the Spanish in Texas as early as 1706. Spanish settlement in New Mexico relied on an extraordinarily harsh form of labor exploitation, as well as a relentless Catholic missionary pressure. In 1680, the people known to the Spanish as the Pueblos revolted, overthrowing Spanish control, albeit temporarily. The destabilization of Spanish rule in New Mexico and its much thinner hold on the northwest frontier in Texas created a vacuum into which Comanche migrations arrived. Comanche people generally confederated into loosely allied kinship networks known as bands, with an estimated 13 distinct bands spread across a vast space known to the Spanish as the Comancheria. In Texas, 5 of those bands came to dominate the plains of the Panhandle region with a substantial presence near Palo Duro Canyon. Having acquired horses in the 16th and 17th centuries, indigenous hunters of the Great Plains, such as the Apache, Comanche, Sioux, and others, became skilled hunters of large and small game. Migrations into Texas followed game, primarily bison, but the large cattle ranches of Spanish Texas proved as equally tempting to Comanche hunters, who developed a reputation among the Spanish as merciless raiders. Once established on the northwestern frontier of Spanish Texas, Comanche bands routinely plunged south to raid the major cities of northern Mexico, often crossing the Rio Grande. The small population in Texas contributed to Mexico's inability to defend its northern communities. But the Comanche also struck at the Spanish missionary efforts scattered across Texas in the early 1700s, which sought to convert Native Americans in Texas and grow the population. Although the Spanish noted the Comanches in New Mexico as early as 1706, it was not until a Comanche raid on their rival Apaches brought them to the notice of Spanish missionaries in Texas in the 1740s. Seeking to expel or destroy the Apache from West Texas, the Comanches ran into conflict with Spanish authorities seeking to establish a mission among the Apache at San Saba. In 1758, after more than a decade of conflict, 2,000 Comanche attacked and destroyed the mission. 2 priests were among the dead, and a Spanish military expedition sent in response found itself overwhelmed and defeated on the Red River shortly afterward. In 1762, the Comanche and the Spanish signed a treaty obligating the Comanche to leave Catholic Apaches in peace. Yet this peace was not to last. Sporadic archaeological exploration of San Saba have continued the past several decades, unearthing a ruin of enormous historical and cultural interest near present-day Menard, Texas. For the next several decades, Spain, and after independence Mexico, remained powerless to expel the Comanche, to halt their raids on cattle ranches, on Spanish towns, or other native communities. Nor could Spain or Mexico encourage substantial migration into Texas beyond the cities of San Antonio and Nacogdoches, or small settlements on the Gulf Coast and Red River. In fact, Spain and Mexico contemplated and then encouraged large-scale immigration from Europe and the United States in order to strengthen its hold on Texas, in defiance of Comanche presence. As other native populations resented or abandoned missionization, most of the Spanish religious sites were secularized in the late 18th century, leaving former missions like the Alamo to serve as military garrisons on a frontier always wary of Comanche raids. On the eve of the Texas Revolution in 1835, the United States undertook an extraordinarily cruel commitment to expel Native Americans from the American Southeast. This genocidal campaign of clearing the Cherokee, Creek, Seminole, Choctaw, and Chickasaw peoples forced their relocation into Indian Territory, or modern Oklahoma. As the military compulsively detained and escorted those who had refused to voluntarily relocate, it established a series of frontier forts such as Fort Gibson in Indian Territory. At Fort Gibson, prominent antebellum military and political leaders bumped elbows, shared their experiences from wars of 1812 or conflicts with the Seminoles and others during the Indian removal era. Sam Houston had left Tennessee to join the Cherokee in Oklahoma, operating a mercantile store at Fort Gibson. Enlisted soldiers at the fort included Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederacy, Stephen Kearny, a commander of the war in Mexico, and Daniel Boone's son, Nathan. In 1834 and 1835, the U.S. military sent 2 exploratory missions into the plains, seeking to make contact and diplomatically negotiate with Plains Indians such as the Comanche. In fact, Sam Houston accepted a federal appointment as a representative of the United States, seeking to acquire Comanche consent to the relocation of the Cherokee on Comanche lands. These expeditions included soldiers, merchants, diplomats, scientists, and artists, and among the most prominent members is the painter and ethnographer George Catlin. For Americans entranced by the way of life of Plains Indians, Catlin's portraits of various nations at work, rest, and play have long captured the public fascination. Catlin's Indian gallery portraits of the 1830s include more than 500 paintings of Comanches, Pawnee, Omaha, Cheyenne, Crow, and other nations. The collection now resides in the Smithsonian, but more than 700 sketches and many more hundreds of paintings rest in museums and private collections. For the earliest visual representation of the Comanches, we are indebted in many ways to George Catlin's work. Once Texas secured its independence, the Republic inherited the Comanche frontier threat from Spain and Mexico. Wide expansion into West Texas under the new independent nation led to increased conflict between the Comanche and white Texans. Raids by the Comanche into San Antonio and closer to the Gulf Coast, striking on occasion cities like Victoria and Refugio, only fueled greater conflict between Texans and the Comanches of the plains. In 1836, Comanche raiders abducted a young girl named Cynthia Ann Parker from Fort Parker. Comanches frequently abducted women and children from raids into Spanish, Anglo, or other Native American communities. Women and children were compelled to work in Comanche villages, but often acculturated into Comanche lifestyles, as Cynthia Ann Parker did. She had married Comanche Chief Pete Nocona, raised 3 Comanche children, including future Chief Quanah Parker, and yet when caught and returned to her Anglo family in 1860, Parker was despondent, running away several times, seeking to return to the Comanche, with whom she'd resided for nearly 25 years. In 1840, the Texas Republic's presidential Lamar administration invited Comanches to a diplomatic meeting in San Antonio. When the Comanches initially refused to return abducted Anglo children, the council proceedings nearly broke down. Upon delivering some Anglo and Hispanic children, with evidence of beatings and abuse, including burn scars, the Texans held the Comanche negotiators in detention within the council house. A Comanche attack on the town left 35 Comanches dead, including a dozen chiefs. 7 Texans died, but after the battle, more than 30 Comanche women and children were subsequently detained and held captive by the Texas government. Comanche attacks followed swiftly, with raids on San Antonio, at Plum Creek, at Linville and Lockhart, and deep into South Texas, including another attack on Victoria. A military response by Texas pressed the Comanche into Oklahoma, where they remained beyond the reach of Lamar's extermination policy. Removed from the state, they continued nonetheless to sporadically raid the Panhandle and West Texas throughout the 1840s. The subsequent Sam Houston administration sought conciliation and diplomacy. Lamar had not only provoked a disastrous conflict with the Comanche, he had also countenanced a military expulsion of the Cherokee from East Texas. As early as the 1820s and 1830s, as the United States pushed the Cherokee west, many traveled to Spanish Texas seeking opportunities to settle in the eastern region of the state. Cherokee agents applied in Mexico City at the same time as Stephen F. Austin to acquire land titles, and they continued to do so in the Spanish Mexican, and Republic of Texas eras. Sam Houston favored their petition to establish a community in Texas, yet Lamar remained firmly opposed. In his second administration, Houston worked hard to restore peace between Anglo-Texans and the Cherokee in the east and the Comanche in the west. Although the Texas government and Comanches did indeed sign a treaty in 1844 that brought 4 years of warfare to a close, the treaty became more or less moot once the United States annexed Texas a year later. As a part of the frontier of the United States, Texas now became the front line between white settlement, and the United States military established a string of frontier forts to protect white settlers. If you have an opportunity to visit the extant forts, now largely state parks, you'll be given an extraordinary chance to get to know the landscape and the lives of the American and Comanche peoples, divided from one another by the increased U.S. troop presence. As the expansion of white pioneer settlements pushed west, the line of military forts moved with them. Intruding on land held by Apache and Comanche peoples for over 150 years, the military forts and white settlers became increasingly vulnerable to violence. In the 1830s, a war between the Apache, Mexico, and Texas would continue, spreading into New Mexico and Mexico, and bringing the United States in the 1850s, up until the defeat of Geronimo's Apache band as late as the 1890s. In the 1850s, warfare with the Comanche renewed. Their defeat, this time, led to their temporary installation on a reservation in Texas before being expelled into Oklahoma once again. In 1867, the United States sought a final peace with the Plains Indians and held a large diplomatic council at Medicine Lodge Creek in Kansas. In one of the final treaties of this diplomatic round, the Comanches, Kiowas, and Apaches agreed to accept reservations on the western half of Indian Territory, between the boundaries of the reservations established for the Cherokee, Choctaw, and other southeastern Indian nations. Comanche lands in Indian Territory were designated adjacent to the Texas Panhandle, and not surprisingly, the Comanche frequently raided into Texas despite the provisions of the 1867 treaty. In short, the reservation lands were simply not sufficient to sustain the Comanche community, and the Comanche returned to Texas to ancestral lands which they had been hunting in for more than 150 years. Large-scale dissatisfaction with the Medicine Lodge Treaty by Native Americans, combined with repeated white settler violations, led most Native nations to officially or unofficially abrogate the treaty. By the early 1870s, warfare between the United States and various Plain Indian nations had resumed. The wars of the Sioux in the Upper Plains have consumed much of this nation's history of the conflict, while in Texas the Comanche and Apache wars resumed as well. In 1874, Comanche resistance to detention led to the Red River War. Ironically, it was Quanah Parker, the son of Cynthia Ann Parker, who had ascended to leadership among the Texan Comanches. Quanah Parker led the Comanches' final movement of resistance before the United States destroyed the Comanche. In response to the Red River War and the Comanche Uprising, the United States mobilized 5 divisions of frontier soldiers to converge on the Palo Duro Canyon region of the Texas Panhandle. Quanah Parker and his band of Comanche relied on the mastery of the landscape to evade the U.S. military, often retreating back to the reservation in Oklahoma. As soldiers from Fort Concho and Richardson in Texas joined soldiers from Fort Sill of Oklahoma, Fort Dodge of Kansas, and Fort Union of New Mexico, the Comanche were simply overwhelmed. Commander Ranald Mackenzie, in command of an African-American unit of Buffalo soldiers stationed at Fort Concho, ordered the slaughter of Comanche horses. Mackenzie and U.S. troops burned more than 400 Comanche villages and shot nearly 2,000 horses. The Comanche population in 1800 numbered nearly 28,000. By the end of the Red River War, there were less than 2,000 counted in the United States Census of the reservation. Nearly 70 years of continuous warfare had left the Comanche in devastation. In defeat and installed again on a reservation in Oklahoma, the Comanche found themselves conjoined to fellow Kiowa and Apache signatories of the Medicine Lodge Treaty. Over several decades, these nations intermarried and their cultures blended. And yet at times in the 20th century, traditionalists' revivals might pull Comanches or Apaches in the other direction toward preserving their culture in the face of assimilation and amalgamation with other native peoples. And yet, the Comanche population grew. Today, with more than 14,000 members, the nation also includes more than 35 resident Comanche in Texas. Beginning in the late 19th century, with the passage of the Dawes Act in 1886, Native Americans began steadily losing autonomy and possession of reservation lands, despite what previous treaties had guaranteed. The white pressure for land was too strong, while a growing but earnest Christian missionary concerned with Native American poverty also sought alternatives to reservation life. Envisioning a head of household as an independent land or farm owner, Native Americans now faced a reform known as allotment. Each male head of household would receive a modest farm or land, now individually and privately owned, to subsist on for his family. Remaining reservation land would be sold, ultimately finding its way to white American ownership, be it for railroad routes or pioneer farms. The Comanche were unable to put off the same allotment pressures that swept the plains, and by 1901 found the United States government dissolving their reservation. Shortly after allotment, American financier J.P. Morgan hired photographer Edward Curtis to undertake a comprehensive photographic tour of the American West. Curtis was tasked with capturing the natural beauty, the newly built landscape, and of course, to produce ethnographic portraits of Native Americans of the West. His documentary photographs of more than 80 tribes, including the Comanche, produced more than 40,000 images. This collection of images rivals only Catlin's paintings from 70 years earlier in documenting the experience of Plains Indians before and after warfare and reservation life. An anthropologist from the Smithsonian accompanied Curtis, and they conducted thousands of hours of recorded interviews and recorded Native American folk songs, rituals, and stories that remain preserved on wax cylinders. As noted above, the Comanche persevered. In Oklahoma, and after allotment, all over the American West, including in Texas, the Comanche population grew. From less than 2,000 to now more than 14,000, the Comanche continued to preserve their traditions and culture in political, religious, and mutual aid societies across the American West. Comanches served as code talkers in World War II, and they participated in the Native American civil rights struggles of the 1960s and 70s. As a consequence of their long history of violent conflict with Spanish, Texan, and American frontier settlers, the Comanche have persisted in popular culture as barbaric or savage threats to civilization. This motif was shared by the Apache and the Sioux, who, like the Comanche, were villainized in frontier military memoirs, Old West traveling shows, dime store pulp Western novels, comic books, and eventually Hollywood films. Despite this disparaging portrayal, the Comanche, like many indigenous people, have always been here, present at the beginning, and they continue to share their lives and experiences alongside the entire sweep of U.S. history through every era. Thank you for joining us for this Fort Bend County Library's Texas Talks on the Comanche. Have a great week.